Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Dashboard Fridays. I'm Adam from SquaredUp, and today I'm joined by Dan from our solutions team. Hey Dan.
Hi, Adam. Good to be here.
Thank you very much. Dan is fresh off the plane from Las Vegas from a Gartner event last week. Very full of enthusiasm to be talking about SquaredUp dashboards today after a week of good practice. Dan's going to join. Dan is joining us to talk about the GCP plugin. Specifically, we're going to be looking at some Kubernetes dashboards today. So, Dan, I'll bring the dashboard up. Why don't you just give us a quick walkthrough of what's on the dashboard?
Cool. Yeah. So this dashboard is surfacing or using our Google Compute Engine and Kubernetes Engine plugins that essentially we're surfacing technical metrics for specifically our Kubernetes Engine clusters, node pools, and our pods as well. Typically for people, this is for people who are SREs or perhaps engineering teams who need to view the technical metrics that come with the GKE clusters and node pools. So essentially, this is to help understand if there's any sort of health issues with those, if there's any performance issues with those that could affect the sort of applications that are being served by your Google Kubernetes Engine sort of clusters, essentially.
Great. So I can see at the top there we've got some cluster health and some node pool health. And then we're jumping into sort of CPU utilization, so that infrastructure metrics. Why don't you just give us a quick walkthrough of what the dashboard shows?
Sure. So at the top here, we've got our sort of default health status metrics surfaced by SquaredUp. So this is on the one on the top left here is scoped to our GKE cluster. This is a wide scope, so if you had more than one GK cluster, you'd see them in here as well. But in this demo environment, we just have the one called Online Boutique. Essentially, if there was any issues with this, so availability of the cluster, if there's any sort of scaling issues, or if there was any issues with the node pools that belong to this cluster, this would turn red. And we have an alert set up on here as well, a monitoring alert. So if there was any issues, you'd sort of find out via our monitoring feature. As well as that, on the top right, we have the same sort of thing, but scoped to our node pools. So again, in this environment, we just have the one node pool within this cluster. But again, if you had a cluster with multiple node pools, or multiple clusters with multiple node pools, then they would show up here as well. Same sort of thing if there was any issues with scaling or availability or just the general health of this, then you'd see this would turn red essentially, and you'd be alerted via our monitoring tool again. So scrolling down, we have a few more metrics. These are a different visualization. This is like a line graph visualization of our resource utilization, specifically the top one here being the CPU of our GKE node pools, or nodes, I should say. So within this node pool, we have two nodes. So you can see here, we've got two showing up here. If I hover over, you get a bit more detail as to where these are located. So we've got our project location being US West 1A, the project and the cluster as well, I should say. And you can see we're sitting roughly here around sort of 13-12% on either of these. This is quite important to understand if you're someone like a nice SRE, or you're in charge of managing the health of your GKE clusters and nodes. Essentially, if auto scaling isn't enabled, this would give you an indication as to potentially if this was at more of a higher level of CPU, that could indicate some performance issues, some potential availability issues, and also some maybe Kubernetes specific issues. So if there's any scaling issues, or if things were unable to provision, like pods were unable to provision, high CPU could indicate that. So that's quite a useful metric to have. As well as that, you could set up some monitoring on this. So if you hit a certain threshold, you go over sort of 90%, for instance, that is quite a useful monitor as well. Additionally, as well, just on this one, if you have auto scaling enabled on your Kubernetes sort of node pools, this could show when that could have happened. So you could see a big jump in CPU availability, for example. Scrolling down, I've got a bit more of the same, but this time memory utilization per GKE node. So similar to CPU, we've got our memory set up here, or available memory, I should say. Again, this could indicate availability and performance issues if this was high and auto scaling was disabled, either sort of vertical or horizontal auto scaling. So this is quite important to understand. Similar to the CPU one, could indicate some availability or performance issues, and it again could also indicate if you had auto scaling enabled, available memory could jump up, for example, and it could indicate an auto scaling event. So it's quite important to understand that as well. Additionally, just scrolling down as well, so we've got our ephemeral and allocatable storage. So these are quite sort of Kubernetes specific, I suppose, metrics. So obviously GKE it's a managed service from Google. Essentially, they have ephemeral storage. So usually the storage can go up and down based on availability and how you set up your clusters. So again, it's quite important to understand whether this goes up or down at any point. And also the you could essentially understand the utilization of that available storage as well. If your storage usage was to grow higher or close to your ephemeral storage availability, then again it could indicate that if you were to provision anything new, being an engineering team, whether that would be successful, whether you had enough storage for that, or whether you had to potentially provision more for your cluster. Essentially, again, quite a useful metric. Again, it's something that you could alert on as well. So essentially, if it ever gets close to that available level, your ephemeral storage usage, then you could alert on that and understand if you need to provision any more. So scrolling down a little bit more, so we've got our egress and ingress setup for our total network essentially usage. So this is calculated based off of the network coming off of the hosts that host your node pools essentially on your nodes. So if I hover over here again, you can see the names of your nodes, of your GKE nodes, and again, quite important to understand if you have any peak times, or if network is particularly high at any given point, or if it spikes up, then it's important to understand for things like, again, performance. That if you're at a busy period, you might want to provision more resource for this, and it also just helps you understand at what points of the day, or is the app being accessed the most, or the service being accessed the most. Again, for the same sort of thing goes for the ingress as well. So this is typically users coming in on a public app, or if your app depends on something in your GKE cluster, then it could indicate sort of high usage for that as well. Additionally, could potentially indicate any issues. So for example, if suddenly the network ingress or egress just drops off a cliff totally and hits right at sort of rock bottom when it's normally quite a lot higher, could indicate some issues that need investigating. So it's worth understanding that. Also, again, for GKE and obviously with GCP in general, network egress cost is quite an important factor as well. So for example, if this shoots up and stays at a really high point for whatever reason, it's worth investigating, because it could be costing you more money than you need to be spending essentially. So really useful to understand that metric. And then just at the bottom here as well, I've got a few more. So log bytes, this is worth understanding as well, especially if you have sort of your logs exported to Google Cloud Monitoring or Google Cloud Logging, or any other sort of third-party logging service. Again, if this drops off a cliff and hits 0, it's worth looking into, because you might not be surfacing any logs. So if something were to go wrong in the future, you might not understand it, so it's worth identifying that. And then just at the bottom here, some cost metrics. Obviously, this is quite a small demo environment, so it's a big 0 there. But if this was to climb up, then you could alert on that, or you could understand your sort of KPIs around cost essentially as well.
Nice. So primarily, I mean, people often forget Kubernetes is fundamentally just VMs running behind some fancy provisioning infrastructure, right? It's kind of like the middle ground between the on-prem data center and going sort of full platform as a service, and just sort of outsourcing everything to a cloud provider. So it's not surprising that the important things on this dashboard are CPU, memory, disk, network, that kind of stuff. But there are some pretty like Kubernetes specific insights that you've just talked us through. So yeah, that's pretty interesting dashboard, and obviously cost as well, because you're paying Google to run it. Well, ours is free. Luckily, I'm sure everybody wants to see 0 on that gauge, but unfortunately for us, it is just because it doesn't really do much, right? Are there any associated benefits to putting this data into a dashboard in SquaredUp versus just using it sort of straight in the GCP console? What's the perk of putting it in SquaredUp?
Yeah, so there's a few actually. So obviously Google Cloud monitoring is a great tool. If you're sort of a single cloud, for example, or you get to have one project, for example, in GCP that you only have to worry about, and you're sort of very laser focused on that. Obviously, one of the main advantages of putting it squared up is you could have a wider scope essentially. So you can have uh, GK clusters just from not only one project in GCP, for example. With the Google side of things, you have to be quite laser focused on that. So you can only have one environment really at a time that you're viewing, unless you do some proper custom sort of MQL queries to the contrary. With this, it's just a lot with SquaredUp, it's a lot easier essentially. So you just widen your scope to encapsulate more projects. You can have them all on one dashboard essentially. As well as that as well, you can surface these sort of metrics alongside for example, if your hybrid cloud, if you use AWS EKS for your Kubernetes or any other related service, you can surface them on the exact same dashboard, and just view them alongside each other. So if they ever rely on each other for dependencies and one goes down, you can see that on your single dashboard without having two tabs open or two screens up in the office to understand that. As well as that, obviously with SquaredUp, you can pull in some detailed metrics from things like Prometheus. Like, it's quite common in Kubernetes clusters to have a Prometheus workspace provisioned within your clusters or alongside them. So you can surface more application level metrics as well as pod level metrics, which typically Google don't surface via their APIs. That's quite common thing to do, and with those Prometheus sort of dashboards or metrics, you can put them again alongside your sort of more health status ones like we're showing here. So you can get a deeper application level understanding alongside your infrastructure understanding. So it's really sort of useful to have those metrics next to each other if you need to.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's obviously what we build SquaredUp for. So it's really cool to see that. Yeah, there's a really solid case with Kubernetes. And I think that point around sort of people using multiple clouds is very valid. You might be running sort of Azure Kubernetes. You might be running AWS and Kubernetes and AWS as well. And yeah, that single dashboard, single tile, the health of all your clusters across all your clouds is pretty cool. And I guess the audience can be much bigger as well. Maybe there's a service desk team and you don't want to have to give them all access to like every monitoring tool at your disposal. You can give them a dashboard that just either summarizes the data they need, or it gives them those key metrics they can drill down, they can see a bit more.
Well, exactly, and that's quite an important point actually, because it's if you were to give them, for example, if you didn't have SquaredUp and you wanted those types of people, service desk people, or even sort of higher ups to see into your metrics, it would require giving them IAM access to your Google Cloud environment, which is nothing to scoff at. Essentially, often it meets with compliance issues, it meets with security team button heads, essentially around getting people who don't need to be in that necessarily viewing those metrics in the monitoring tool for GCP. So again, it's quite useful to have SquaredUp in those cases, because you can surface that data without without those with our permissions on our side.
Nice. I guess not to make this sound too much like a sales video for SquaredUp features, but with
No,
with SQL Analytics, I mean, there's some pretty cool stuff you could do to actually like combine a lot of that data, like flagging, combine. Well, simple one is just like combining metrics, right? So maybe you just want one tile with the average CPU of every cluster in every cloud, even any maybe like hosted Kubernetes, that you've got that kind of stuff as well. So yeah, there's some really nice benefits to that sort of the BI layer on top of it. That's pretty cool. So yeah, some sexy infrastructure metrics for everyone for today. Anything else worth mentioning? Anything about the plugin setup? Is it all pretty straightforward? If you know GCP, you'll find it easy.
Yeah, it's super easy. Essentially, all we require at SquaredUp is essentially a service account on your GCP environment that has the necessary permissions. Obviously, if you're servicing Kubernetes Engine, that requires if you're following best practice, you'd want to give specific Google Kubernetes Engine permissions to that service account. You wouldn't want to just give it overall owner role. And likewise, if you're using it for any other Google services, you want to give that necessary permissions to that service account. And it's just really getting a JSON key from that service account, putting it into SquaredUp, and it should be up and running. When it comes to cost data, if you use GCP, you'll be familiar with it. That cost goes into a BigQuery data set. Essentially, we just require the name of that data set, so we know where to look for it. And apart from that, you're really away and dashboarding essentially.
Nice. And again, so just to reiterate, at the moment it is sort of a single plugin for GCP. So if
Yes.
it's not setting up 15 different plugins for the 15 different services. It is pretty straightforward. And as you add permissions to that service account, we're able to index more things, surface more data, that kind of stuff. So you can start specifically with GKE if you're interested. But yeah, sort of spreading that out is easy enough. Nice. Thank you very much, Dan. I'll go ahead and wrap us up. So yeah, well, firstly, thanks to Dan for joining us today. We have a few more GCP dashboards coming. So Dan will be back making further appearances. You can check out the write up for the plugin over at our dashboard gallery, squareup.com/dashboard gallery. And if you're stuck with anything, if you have any questions, if you've got any great ideas, some enhancements for these dashboards, head over to community.squareup.com. It's our big community forum. There's a whole section dedicated just to SquaredUp Cloud and plugins, so feel free to jump in there. But that's it for today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks all.
Thank you.